So first, we're going to understand trust. I have a bit of a different approach to what trust is. Then we're going to talk about how to build it.
Okay, well, let's get going. Good morning. Welcome to Will Work for Food, the New Possibilities Hour. Today is August 10th, 2023, and it's our pleasure to welcome Kwame Christian, who will speak to us about trust and relationships. But before we get to Kwame, let's talk about Jeff's favorite part, and that is, what is the number and how much so far have do we know about in donations to food banks? Jeff?
Thank you, Jean. You're right. It's always a delight to talk about just how much our generous audiences have contributed to food banks worldwide in honor of our great speakers since the series began, since Natalie founded it in the spring of 2020. Today, I'm delighted to report that so far we are aware of $430,000, $430,914.92 contributed to food banks worldwide by our wonderful listeners and viewers. Thank you all so much. Back to you, Jean.
Thank you. And that is over 4.5 million meals, probably, depending upon the buying power of a particular food bank to which donations have been made. And that said, there is no charge for these programs. We've been doing them now since the spring of 2020. And all that is asked is, if you are able, that you make a donation in any amount to either the food bank that's been recommended or suggested by the speaker, which in this case is the, let's see here, the Ohio Mid-Ohio Food Collective, and or your local food bank. It doesn't matter. And I know some people have even told me that they didn't really have money to donate, but they've donated their time to go help it work in food banks, which is absolutely amazing too. So we would welcome that. And then please let either Natalie, Jeff Kachavit, or myself know about this amount, and we'd be more than happy to add it to our running total. And that's Natalie Armstrong-Motin, if you don't know her. So anyway, that's it for that. Let's get down to business. And Kwame Christian, who is so kind and generous to donate his time for us today, he is going to speak to us on Trust Reimagined, a fresh approach to building relationships. Kwame, I have to put on my glasses here, sorry about that. He's a two-time best-selling author. He's a business lawyer and founder and CEO of the American Negotiation Institute, a global consulting firm specializing in negotiation and conflict resolution. He's also host of the #1 negotiation podcast in the world, Negotiate Anything, and I highly recommend it. It's fascinating, with over 5 million downloads and listeners from all over the world. So just as Will Work for Food, the New Possibilities Hour, has participants from all over the world, so does Kwame's podcast. So with that, without further ado, I mean, there's just so much one could say about Kwame. Let's turn it over to Kwame and let him tell us about trust and building relationships. And if you could say something about your food bank.
Absolutely. Well, listen, one thing that Jean didn't say in the introduction is the only reason we're the #1 negotiation podcast is because Jean was on the podcast. Okay, so we have to make sure that we mention that. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us. And so I'll just say a quick word about the Mid-Ohio Food Collective. It's a food bank that I donated time to when I was in college, and they do a great job, just like every other food bank, but it's near and dear to my heart because that was, I believe, the first food bank that I donated time to. So if you could make a donation, that would be greatly appreciated. All right, well, let's get to the presentation. Is this presentation working? Can you see it? All right, good. Listen, it doesn't always happen. So I'm glad it worked this time. All right, so let's have some fun in the chat. Just put in the Zoom. Let's know like what state, what country, where are you zooming in from? Let's get an idea. I think that's always fun to start off with. Ooh, Canada, Arkansas, nice. France, Minnesota, Sacramento, two folks from Arkansas, Maryland, this is great. Texas, do we have any Buckeyes in here? No Ohio folks, where are my people? England, New York, Arizona, Canada, California. Listen, we'll get some Ohio ones eventually, I'm sure. But great, we've got a really diverse audience. Perfect. So when we think about the topic of trust, what would you say your goal is for a presentation like this? What would your goal be? Oh, if we have Hong Kong, yes. So yes, what would your goal be for a trust presentation? Just go ahead and put it in the chat and let's see what people come up with. And as you're developing your thoughts in the chat, I just want you to know just a bit about the way that I present. I present better the more I'm interrupted. Okay, I present better the more I'm interrupted. So if you have questions, ask those questions, because most likely somebody else has the same question. And when I ask questions, my questions are not rhetorical. I actually want to hear from you. Okay, so this is great. So want to talk about how to build trust. Great, just want to learn more about it. Learn how trust impacts mediations. Yes, I'm a former mediator, so trust is a big part of that. Understanding how trust can help us break down barriers, how to be authentic, how to grow trust, what depletes it, and how to recover when it's been damaged. David, to that point, let me shout out an episode of the podcast. It's almost 1,000 episodes. It's like 930 episodes, but there's an episode on how to rebuild trust when you lost it. And it is with Kim Ellsbach from the University of UC Davis. And you know what I learned? You do not want to lose somebody's trust because it's hard to get it back, but there's a method to building it back. So we'll talk about that too. Learn how to develop trust with litigants and their lawyers, understand trust deeper, and learn a way I can support relationship building capacities, authenticity and trust between diverse people, and overcoming skepticism. Oh, this is great. This is great. We're touching on a lot of the topics we'll talk about. So first, we're going to understand trust. I have a bit of a different approach to what trust is. Then we're going to talk about how to build it. And then we're just going to open it up to questions and answers if we still have time, because like I said, I think I want to hear from you as the questions come to your mind. Okay. What is trust? Everybody here wants to build it. Everybody here wants to avoid losing it. Let's work together. Let's create an operational definition. What is trust? And again, my perspective on it is a little bit different. So how would you define trust? And we have another goal from Roger, how to negotiate effectively when trust cannot be established. Yes, having conversations with a trust deficit is tough, but it can be done, right? So that's a really good one too. So when you think about the word trust, what comes to mind? How would you define it? Okay, good. Strong starts, Nancy. So feeling safe, one of the terms we hear a lot about now is psychological safety, right? So feeling safe in a relationship. If somebody feels safe, then they're more likely to be vulnerable and open up. This is great. The ability to defer to another person, functionally at least, when evidence is lacking. That's big, right? So we recognize that overcoming skepticism, somebody talked about that in the chat too. If you have somebody's trust, then they're going to be less skeptical. And a lot of times we might not have evidence readily available at hand, but if you have a trusting relationship, it won't matter as much because they trust you regardless. Tina, leads to openness and also comes from openness too. Good. Comfort of understanding, investment in the relationship. So Anna, that's a really strong word too, investment. So with intentionality, we are putting something into the relationship. I like to think about the concept of trust in terms of how we build it. It's like we build trust in drips, but we lose it in buckets. So what I want you all to do is start to think strategically about how every interaction can be turned into a trust building opportunity. Every interaction is an opportunity for us to make strategic deposits and investments into the relationship bank account. Because at some point we're going to need to make a withdrawal. We might need to ask for something. We might have to engage in a difficult conversation. And the more trust that has been invested into the relationship over time, the more resilient the relationship will be in the face of difficulty. So that's a good word. Belief in the truth of someone or something, right? Good. Being brave to be vulnerable. I like that. History of sound character and honesty. So Lisa, again, we're talking about the fact that it takes time. We have a track record, a little bit of evidence we can look back on to substantiate the trust. And then we have unconditional respect without agreement. Oh, that's good. That is really good. Okay, now, trivia question. All right. If I were to put the face of somebody that you know on this screen, how long would it take you to know whether or not you trust them? How long would it take you to make that determination of whether or not you trust that person? Would you need to take out your like calculator, do some kind of 10-point analysis, right? It's instant, seconds, if that, right? So it doesn't seem like you required rational thought at all, did it? You didn't think about it, you felt it. So trust is nothing more than a positive bias. Trust is a positive bias. So let's simplify this word bias. A bias is either a preference toward or a prejudice against someone or something that happens automatically and subconsciously. So if I trust somebody, this is a positive bias. And what does that get us? It gets us a lot more vulnerability. The person is willing to share. They're willing to be open and give information. They're willing to be more generous. They're not skeptical, right? So imagine this situation. Let's say, people come to me for negotiation advice trainings, and sometimes they want quick tips and tricks, right? What are the things I need to say in order to get the outcome that I want? Okay, great. Well, here's the reality. I can give you something to say if we want to think really tactically. But if you say one line to somebody and they trust you, it is going to be very different from saying the exact same thing to the exact same person and they don't trust you. So when it comes to everything else in our relationship, communication, persuasion, conflict resolution, we have to recognize that trust is an accelerant to whatever the positive goal is that we want to accomplish. It's like the ultimate relationship strategy. And so we can have these difficult conversations in a way that doesn't even need to be strategic or tactical, because if you lay the foundation of trust in the relationship, it almost magically happens that good things happen in the conversation, right? So I want you to think a little bit differently about trust. It's a feeling. And so we want to invest in the relationship over time so we can get the benefits of trust. Okay. So let's go a bit deeper. Let's actually see the inverse, because I touched on this a little bit. Why do we want people to trust us? What happens if people do not trust us? How can you tell? How can you tell if somebody doesn't trust you? What happens if they don't trust you? How does that change the dynamic in the relationship if there is a trust deficit in the relationship? Yep, body language are going to be a little bit more closed off, more self-protective. They don't talk freely. They're reluctant to be open, to share, to reveal. Lack of communication, more guarding and less forthcoming with disclosure. They're suspicious, especially unduly, and they become preoccupied with your motives. Yes, if somebody's questioning your motives, just recognize that the issue isn't so much your motives. The issue is that there is a lack of trust. And so a lot of times we become very defensive. If somebody's like, I don't understand why you're doing this, I'm going to speak to the right thing, not justifying myself or trying to speak directly to my motives. I'm going to try to rebuild the relationship in that moment. I'm going to pause. I'm going to say, hey, correct me if I'm wrong, but it doesn't seem like you feel really comfortable with the way this conversation is going or our relationship, something like that. I'm going to give them an opportunity to address that with specificity. A lot of times people are afraid to do that, but a lot of times it can turn into almost an argumentative type of interaction. If somebody is skeptical of you and they question your motives, you respond with, no, my motives are pure. And you know what they say? They're like, that's exactly what an evil person would say. You're trying to convince me, right? So you have to solve the right problem at the right time. This is great. The communication is less inclusive. We can think inclusive in the terms of like diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we can also think inclusive in terms of collaborative conversation, right? So if I trust somebody, you are on my team. You and me we're the same. We're playing for the same team. But if I don't trust you, you are the other. You are against me, right? And so, yeah, it'll be less inclusive in a number of different ways. And Tina says, body language. There can be no real relationship without trust. This is great. No good faith effort in negotiations. Yeah. So when we think about these, again, the conversations that we're having, whether it's a negotiation, a mediation, just an everyday conversation, it's an opportunity to build trust. And we have to think about that as one of the first things that we consider on a flow chart, right? We can sometimes be too narrowly focused on our agenda in the conversation, what it is that we want to accomplish, but we should not move forward until we've taken the time to establish a strong, trusting relationship, because that's the foundation of a good conversation. Now let's talk about the dark side of trust. Because when you think about the books that were written about trust, and whenever we have presentations like this on trust, we always talk about how amazing trust is. I want more trust, right? Could there be potentially something negative that comes with trust? Something negative that comes with too much trust, perhaps. Aha, Tina, right there, manipulation, right? Because if I trust you, then I'm going to be less critical. I'm going to be less skeptical. I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt. So if you come to me and I trust you and you have a lot of evidence, I'll believe you. If you come to me and I trust you and you don't have a lot of evidence, I'll believe you, right? So this is big. Jocelyn says over-reliance. Yeah, right? We let go of our skepticism to our own detriment, and that ability to think critically is kind of lost. And in difficult conversation, a lot of times we focus on the negative emotions that can get in the way. So when you think about the emotions that come to play in a difficult conversation, what are some of the emotions that might come into play that make the difficult conversation more difficult? Ooh, Nancy, that's deep. You will disbelieve the truth if the person trusted says it's untrue. That's good. That is good. You will disbelieve truth if the person that you trust says it's untrue, right? And yes, David, groupthink will be big as well. So Nancy talks about fear. That's an emotion that'll come into play. Carolyn seconds that. Fear. Is that the only negative emotion? Did I lose you people? Come on now. What other negative emotions have you experienced in a difficult, or maybe Jean, maybe these folks have never experienced a negative emotion in a difficult conversation. Anger, yes. Sadness. Yeah, we're going to see defensiveness, frustration, embarrassment, confusion. These emotions will hold us back in these conversations. And so a lot of times when we think about the material that's focused on how to comport yourself in a negotiation or a difficult conversation or a conflict, they're talking about how you manage the negative emotions. Oh, David, defensiveness is big. That is big, right? But they don't talk about how to manage overly positive emotions, right? That is big too, because we're going to make mistakes because we feel too good. Here's an example. Have you ever heard of high-pitched conversations? No? It'd be weird if you did, because I made it up. It's a term I made up. Okay. So we've all had high-pitched conversations. So check this out. So imagine you're talking with a friend, you're having a good time, everything is going well. And then they say, tell me if this has happened to you. And they say, hey, by the way, I'm moving in a couple of weeks. Can you help me move? And you're like, oh my gosh, yes, that'd be great. I love you. And then what happens? Next week, you have things to do, but you already committed because you were drunk with positive emotions and you made a bad decision, right? So the thing is, the positive emotions can lead us to make bad decisions in a similar fashion that negative emotions can lead us to make bad decisions. And so sometimes if you're having a conversation with somebody and you feel too good, you trust them too much, that is a signal that it might be time to slow things down. So for me, I'm a recovering people pleaser. So I know my natural inclination in a difficult conversation is to be a little bit more passive and concede inappropriately. So if I feel that feeling of concession coming up in the difficult conversation, I'm going to be more skeptical of that emotion because I know I'm prone to that. And so I want you to bring that same mentality to these conversations with people that you like and trust. We don't talk about the strategic challenge of those conversations. And so when you're having a conversation with somebody that you like and trust, and you feel, yes, I want to give this person what they're asking for. Yes, I believe this situation. and you're feeling that really quickly, you should introduce a little bit of skepticism and say, I feel that might have been an emotional thought, not a rational thought. So you want to think about emotions kind of like a pendulum. If you swing too far to the negative, there are going to be problems. But if you swing too far to the positive, there are going to be problems too. And so you want to make decisions when you're kind of in the middle, where you're thinking clearly, a little bit more rational, right? Good. So now let's talk about some psychological strategies to build trust. So before we even get into what it is that we do or say or things like that, just based on your experience, your understanding of trust, what are some things that we can do strategically to build trust? And I know when we're talking about trust and we say strategic trust building, I think that can seem a little bit manipulative. And so I don't want to think that's what we're going for. It still needs to be authentic. But what I'm saying is, how can we be intentional with our endeavors to build trust? That's the difference. Alex, strong start. Declare intentions and expectations to be transparent. This is so important. This is so important. So think about Coca-Cola, one of the most recognizable brands in the world. Let's put ourselves as a fly on the wall in their meeting. Do you ever think you'll hear the marketing department say this? I think we've done it. I think we've gotten enough name recognition. We don't need to market anymore. We're done, folks. We're done. We're good. No more marketing. Is that ever going to happen? No. Everybody knows what Coca-Cola is, right? But they're never going to stop marketing. Why? This is a strategy. It's a psychological strategy, brand recognition. I'm not going to let somebody forget about my brand. And so the thing is, a lot of times we might say our intentions are obvious. I'm a mediator. I'm a third-party neutral. I don't have any dog in this fight, any horse in this race, right? So you should trust me. I don't have no interests. I don't need to tell you that. I'm your friend. I'm your family. I'm your colleague. We're on the same team. I don't need to tell you that. But Alec, you're correct. We have to become our own marketing department. We can't stop letting people know how we care, because they might forget. Because when emotions run high, they might forget. So I want to keep on, again, using these as opportunities to make strategic deposits into the relationship bank account. If I feel positively about a person, I'm going to let them know immediately, because I cannot assume that they do know that thing, right? Here's a good example. Before I say this, just know I have grown a lot in my relationship with Whitney. So Whitney and I got married on graduation day in undergrad. So we've been married for 13 years. And when I was in undergrad, I'm almost embarrassed to tell you, when I was in undergrad, I had this mentality. I thought about it, the word love through an economic lens. It's like, I can't flood the market with this commodity of the word love. Then it loses value, supply and demand. There's too much supply, you know? And so I would be very stingy with telling Whitney I loved her. Clearly that's problematic, right? She needs to know that often, all the time. I can't just say, hey, I'm here. I'm doing nice things. No, you have to be explicit with this. So declaring your intentions early and often in conversations and relationships is critical. And your intention to be transparent, critical, right? Very, very important. So Alec, I'm glad you started with that. Open our ears before our mouth. Yes. Listen more than you speak. This is really important. Whenever I'm doing negotiation trainings, I talk about the 70-30 rule. So I want to be speaking 30% of the time and getting the other person to speak 70% of the time. That's my goal. And what's cool is I have this new app that I can that tracks my speaking time. And so I'm a podcaster. And in one of my podcasts earlier on on Monday, my percentage was 14%. I only spoke 14%, right? Letting them speak. So yesterday I had this incredible guy on the podcast. His name is Robin Drake, former FBI agent, former Marine and FBI agent too. And so his book was called The Code of Trust. And so his job as an FBI agent was to find spies and turn them into double agents. Now, this might shock you. Revealing to an FBI agent that you are a spy is not something you want to do. That's not information you want to disclose. But he said, my number one tool was trust. I would create trust with these people. And when you look at the strategies, the psychological strategy, it's very clear. If you give the person an opportunity to speak about something that they care about, share about something that's important to them, it floods their brain with dopamine, the pleasure neurotransmitter. So it feels good. And now when you think about the psychology of classical conditioning, they feel good because they're given the opportunity to speak. And who happens to be present, giving them the opportunity to feel so good? It's you, right? So those feelings of positivity are going to be associated with you, right? So yes, Michael, open our ears before our mouth. Let them talk. That's going to be big. Body language is going to be big, right? Open body language. When I was mediating, the room was always cold. So I turned myself into a little Kwame pretzel to stay warm, right? And so at the beginning of the mediations, whenever I felt myself naturally go into this position, I would say, hey, just an FYI, I'm not closed off. I'm still here with you. I'm just very cold right now. So don't misread this body language. I'm just cold. So if ever I found myself doing that because of cold, because I was cold, I would disclaim that, hey, because like you said, David, I don't want them to misread that body language. But then if I'm trying to really be engaged, I'm going to lean in, I'm going to open myself up, and I'm going to give those nonverbal encouragers when the time is right, right? So this is really important. Behave consistent with your values. Yeah, consistency in word and deed. One of the best things you can do, Nancy, to build trust is set effective boundaries and say no, right? Because think about it. A lot of times when it comes to relationship building, we say, oh yeah, I want to give, I want to give, I want to give. And then can you all relate to this? Feeling that you're burnt out because you're saying yes to so many people, because you're trying to be so nice to so many people. And then what often happens is that you put so much on your plate that things fall off. You're trying so hard to be nice to everybody that you are not being able to fulfill your commitments. And so from your perspective, I'm trying to give so much and it's just not working. But from their perspective, they don't see all of that on the back end. They just say, listen, this person made a commitment and went back on that commitment. Now I trust them less. And so part of that transparency and being consistent in word and deed, what you say and what you do, is being clear on what you will not do. So if somebody asks me to do something or they have an expectation of me, I want to be very clear on what I can do. Because when you say no really consistently and really strongly, it makes your yeses a lot stronger as well. So setting those boundaries helps to avoid trust traps where you try to give your trust and commit to something that you can't do. It's really important. My husband needs to hear that. Listen, this is free. Well, no, food. You pay in food. Okay, good. So you can send them the recording after the fact. Awesome. Affinity bias. Now, disclaimer here. When we talk about affinity bias in the realm of inclusion within a workplace and a culture, affinity bias is a barrier that we have to overcome. So affinity bias is something, let me just describe it really simply. You are like me, so I like you. You are like me, so I like you. I look at you and I see a little bit of me in you, so I like you more, right? And so that leads to issues of people just kind of cloning themselves within an organization. And so when it comes to inclusion and belonging, it can be a challenge to overcome. So I just want to give that disclaimer before I tell you about how we can utilize affinity bias to our favor. Because I think a lot of times in society, we've gotten to this point where we use this alliterative mental shortcut. B and B, bias is bad. Bias is bad. And that's how it's been trained all the time. Bias is just a psychological reality. There is a way to get rid of all of your biases. There is a way, if anybody's interested. Any guesses? Any guesses? Let's put some guesses in. How do you get rid of all your biases? Die, exactly. You don't want to die. Okay, so since we're all here, let's figure out how we can do this. So for me, bias is just a strategic consideration. It's a ubiquitous element of life that helps us to survive. Could you imagine your life without biases, without mental shortcuts? We'd wake up confused every day. What do I do next? I don't, we need biases to survive. Now we can understand how bias can get in the way, but what can we do to make it work for us? So when it comes to self-reflection helps. Self-reflection helps us to, and so I'm calling this out for Tina. Tina says self-reflection can help to minimize biases. They'll still be there, but we override it with conscious effort. So that's a big point, right? And so what we want to do is recognize, all right, affinity bias is real. You are like me, so I like you. So in the beginning of all of my conversations, what I'm trying to do is slow the conversation down and get to know the person. Again, giving them the opportunity to speak. Tell me about yourself. What is it that you're doing? Those type of things. And this is really important because what I'm going to look for are opportunities to point out our similarities. Oh, you like that? I like that too. Why do you think people complain about the weather? You hate the rain? Me too. Right? So you want to find strategic overlap. So you start to generate some positive momentum in the conversation. Oh, yeah, we went to the same school. Oh, yeah, we're both here trying to fight hunger. This is big, right? So I'm going to find those points of overlap. So you see a little bit of yourself in me and vice versa. And that will help you to trust me a lot more, right? This is really important. It's like if you go to a different country and you see somebody wearing the shirt of your alma mater, you don't know this person at all. I didn't expect to see you. Oh my gosh, I feel close to you because we're similar in that way. It's affinity bias at work. And Alec, to your point, preparation can help. If I do my preparation and I get to know you, then I can start to figure out those areas of overlap and I can steer the conversation in that direction too, right? So if I'm prepared and I understand what you're about a little bit more, then I can point out those similarities a little bit easier. So that's a good call. Okay, empathy. Empathy is another buzzword that we hear a lot about. But again, I think definitions are important. So when we think about empathy, what does that really mean? What is empathy? How would you define it? Because I think a lot of times our misunderstandings about empathy make it harder for us to be empathetic. So we have to get a very clear definition so we can put it into action, because empathy is going to be a really important part of our trust building strategies. Great. So empathy allows us to relate to emotion. Good, strong start. Aha, Roger, this is good. Let's talk about actually feeling what somebody else feels. This is big. So when we're feeling what somebody else feels, definitionally, this is closer to sympathy. Empathy is understanding what somebody else is going through. So empathy is understanding their perspective, their thoughts, and their feelings. Sympathy is feeling what they feel. Now, in a close relationship, I think there are a lot of times where sympathy is important and valuable. Sympathy that is not moderated can become problematic because it could lead us to make emotional concessions. So if, for example, my 7-year-old Kai is in the other room here. And so if Kai's playing video games and I want him to read before, we need to get your skills sharp. School's going to start in 2 weeks, right? And I say, hey, Kai, I need you to do 30 minutes of reading. All right. And then he's like, oh, and then I say, oh man, yeah, I remember when I wanted to play video games too. I feel that. Never mind. I feel that pain. I don't want you to feel that pain. So I'm going to make an emotional concession. And so in negotiation, we talk about the fact that we never want to trade substance for emotion. Just because somebody displays emotion, I don't want to make a concession because of that specific reason. And so you have to make sure that you understand that if you are feeling sympathetic with somebody, it is okay unless it leads you to make a strategic mistake. So that's an important thing. And Joel, having experienced the same issue, having a similar life experience helps you to empathize at a higher level, right? Because if I've never experienced what the person is going through, it's harder for me to understand it. And so that's why it's beneficial to try to expose yourself to as many different experiences as possible. If you have the privilege of being able to travel. But it doesn't need to be some massive international trip. Traveling communities from community to community is very different, right? That can be an incredible cultural experience just going a couple miles down the street. So we want to get as many experiences as possible, because the more experiences we have, the more people we're able to relate to. Right. And so, Carolyn, same thing. If we can experience the same thing, we can put ourselves in their shoes. Roger, for me, empathy connects with the original meaning of compassion, which is to suffer with. Ah, yes. Got it. Got it. Got it. Got it. Yep. That's good. That is really good. Awesome. So we have to remember, empathy is understanding, right? And if we can suffer with the person, compassion leads to greater empathy. And especially when we're talking about these kind of caring occupations, I think this is critical, right? And then when we're also defining empathy, we have to recognize empathy is a skill more so than a feeling. I want you to think it through more so as a skill, because a lot of times somebody might say, I don't like this person, I can't connect with them, and so then they say, and that's why I can't empathize. They use that as an excuse. But you have to understand, you don't need to feel empathetic in order to utilize empathy. You don't need to feel empathetic in order to utilize empathy. If I can listen to the person, ask questions, and listen without judgment, that's a key part of trust building, and understand them, I can empathize with them. And that builds trust, and that builds a foundation that I can build on in the conversation. What is that quote? Can lead us to trade substance for emotion. Yeah, we don't want to trade substance for emotion. If I trade substance for emotion with my 2-year-old, turn him into a brat. I can't just give him everything he wants because he cries. But a lot of times we create these toxic toddler dynamics in our relationships because we just keep on giving people what they want because they're of their emotional state. So trading substance for emotion can be really problematic. Awesome. Okay. So this is a distinction I made in my last book, which I inventively called How to Have Difficult Conversations About Race. You'd never guess what it's about. Right. So there is with that book, what I was doing was I was bringing skills to that difficult conversation. When you read it, you'll understand it's about really the book title should be called How to Have Difficult Conversations About Insert Difficult Topic Here. It's a skills-based book. And I drew out the distinction between what I call psychological empathy and intentional empathy. So psychological empathy is something that happens. Hey, thanks, Gene. Psychological empathy is something that happens automatically. It's not a choice. So imagine if you're watching a violent sport like American football, and your team, your star quarterback is running, and then somebody tackles him, and you can tell he hurt his knee. What happens? What do? You might grimace. You're like, oh, you tense up your body. You might even reach down to your own knee. Was that a choice? Did you say, a logical response for watching this sporting event on TV is for me to grab my own knee because it'll help my player? No, it wasn't. It happened automatically. Why did that happen? Because you see that person as part of your in-group. They are on my team. They are part of me. Somebody who's in my in-group is an extension of me. And then it triggers a stronger connection with our mirror neurons. So going back to what we were talking about, Roger, this is where we start to feel what they feel because I can see myself in them. And so we start to respond with that automatic psychological empathy, right? Now, what we're talking about today is intentional empathy. I'm going to use a skill because if I see a person as the out group, the opposite is true. It is harder for me to empathize. It's harder for me to understand. And so that's why it's so important with these strategies that we're creating. What we're doing is we are creating a dynamic that makes it more likely for us to have the privilege and benefit of psychological empathy while still having the skill of utilizing intentional empathy. So it's a bifurcated strategic approach to building trust. So I'm going to pay attention to biases and figure out how I can ethically trigger positive biases in my favor to avail myself to the benefit of psychological empathy, while at the same time, I'm going to maximize that by using the skill of intentional empathy. Yep. Schoolyard. Yeah. It starts in the schoolyard, on the playground. Yeah. Even before that, because the moment that we can start to recognize these differences between people and groups, that's when we start to congregate, right? It's just a natural human thing. We're tribal by nature. That's our psychology. So we have to recognize that. And then we have to make appropriate considerations for that in the actual conversation. One strategy I like to use is called drawing bigger circles. So a lot of times, if we don't have trust with somebody, what ends up happening is we're drawing a circle around ourselves. What is my in group? In this conversation, it's me. What's my out group in this conversation? It's you. And so what I want to do at the beginning of the conversation in order to create some positive momentum is draw a bigger circle that includes you and me. So how can we do that? How can we do that? How can we start these conversations in a way that starts to trigger in-group bias so they start to see you as similar? What are some strategies that you've used or some strategies that you can come up with? Oh, Roger, I see your question here or your point here. When the quote other party sees and feels visceral identification from the negotiation or neutral, a magic door to solutions opens. Oh, I love that. Visceral identification. Yeah, and that's a strong word, right? It's like visceral, that's something that I feel. It wasn't a choice, right? But I want you to identify with me. That's strong. Good. So Mike, identifying common goals. Bingo. That is big. That is big. And I like to do this reflexively. So here's what I mean. I like to start the conversation off and give them an opportunity to talk about their goals. What is it that you hope to accomplish? Because even though I might have an understanding of what their goal might be in this conversation, I don't know how they would word it. I don't know how they would word it. So then what I'm going to do is, as I'm identifying common goals, I'm going to use the language that they preferred, right? Because I might say, going into this, this is a challenge that we need to address. That might be the way that I describe it, but they might describe the exact same thing as a problem that we need to solve. Okay, cool. And so then I say, yeah, I agree with you. I think this is a problem that we need to solve. And I believe that if we work together, we can come to a solution that works for both of us, right? A minor shift, but the word choice matters, especially when emotions are at play, right? So again, drawing bigger circles, identifying common goals, and trying as much as possible to reflect the language that they use. Ah, yes, what people don't tell you about trust. So this is my mom. I love her a lot. And I feel obligated to tell you that I love her before I tell you the story. Okay. And so how many of you have kids? All right, we got some parents in there. All right. Now, how many of you loved being criticized by your parents about your parenting? Anybody love that? Right. Nobody did. Right. It's frustrating. So I remember one time mom was disagreeing with a decision that I made. And so she was letting me know how she felt about it. And the only reason I was able to utilize this was because I just did a training earlier in the day. I was like, Kwame, you know what you need to do. Use your skills. You use your skills. You can do this. And so when we talk about listening non-judgmentally, it's really tough. And so what I used was a strategy called the empathy loop. So it's a 3-part approach. First, I listen to what the person says. Then I say, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like you're saying X, Y, Z. So I summarize what they're saying. And then I say, am I right on that? Am I close? Did I get that right? However we want to close that, but it's a loop. Use the words that work for you, that feel authentic to you, but it's just listen, summarize by saying, correct me if I'm wrong, or correct me where I'm wrong. So you're inviting correction so they clarify, and you don't advance in the conversation until they say, yeah, you got that. Yes, your understanding is correct, right? So in this conversation, all I did was use the empathy loop and ask open-ended questions. And I did that for 16 straight minutes. 16 straight minutes. And then at the end, I said, okay, is there anything else you'd like to tell me? And she said, no. It's like, all right, well, thank you for sharing. And then she said, Kwame, are you okay? I said, yeah, I'm fine. I am okay. I just wanted to make sure I had a full understanding of your perspective. Would you be interested in hearing my perspective? Yeah. And then I took 60 seconds, explained myself, and she's like, oh, I get it now. That was a good call. You were right. That's the end of the story. that is the end of the story. So what happened? I turned it into an opportunity to create a deeper connection. So we built trust in the process. I didn't jump in and correct her when she was saying things. So I didn't needlessly turn it into an argument. And I gave her the opportunity to feel respected. And I utilized empathy to show that I understood what she was saying the whole time. And a lot of times, what we don't realize is that what it takes to be successful in these conversations is just the discipline and resilience to hold firm to fundamental strategies of communication long enough for good things to happen. That's it, right? But here's what people don't tell you about listening, especially listening non-judgmentally. Not only is it hard, but it kind of hurts. Like during that conversation, one of the most interesting experiences was feeling that desire to jump in and say something and it registering through my body like a physical pain. Like it felt bad. It felt bad. And a lot of times we feel those feelings bubbling up inside and we say, I need to say something. I need to correct that point. And we misread the psychological signal. And so we feel that and we say, I need to jump in and say something. And it's actually a strategic misstep. Sometimes that feeling of discomfort during a difficult conversation might actually be a sign that you're on the right track, right? Listening non-judgmentally, especially when you disagree with somebody, is very difficult to do. And it will feel very hard. And your responsibility is to do it anyway. This is really important. It is simple, but it is not easy. And then we'll wrap up with compassionate curiosity. So this is my framework for addressing difficult conversations. It's a 3-part framework. So step 1 is acknowledge and validate the emotions. Step 2 is get curious with compassion. Step 3 is joint problem solving. So if I recognize an emotional challenge, I'm going to identify and label that emotional challenge, saying it sounds like or it seems like. So we talked about frustrated. So it seems like this is a frustrating situation for you. Or I can tell that this is something that you care a lot about. And then as I recognize the emotional temperature starting to drop in the room, which is what I want, then I'm going to shift with getting curious with compassion. I'm going to ask open-ended questions with a compassionate tone. And then once I gather enough information, I'm going to shift to joint problem solving. So I'm going to work with them collaboratively using what I call future-focused problem solving. So I'm going to ask, what does our relationship look like going forward? What do we do to make sure this doesn't happen again? Because a lot of times negative emotions exist in the past. That's where blame and judgment live. And so one of the best things you can do in difficult conversations is change the grammatical tense to the future and focus on the future. And that makes it a lot more collaborative. Alex says, I call these moments moral generosity. When you don't owe someone that bandwidth, yet you give it anyways, because of course it pays dividends. Beautiful. Oh, I love that term, moral generosity. Brilliant, brilliant. Awesome, peeps. Well, this is great. We're right on time. We have about 10 minutes for Q&A. So what questions do you have for me? And thank you for the participation. It made it flow a lot better. So I appreciate that. What questions do you have? And as you formulate your questions, let me just say, check out our podcast. We have Negotiate Anything, which is 7 days a week, featuring celebrities like Gene Lawler on the podcast. Okay, so make sure you check that out. We have a Spanish podcast, Negociación desde Cero. And so that comes out about weekly or bi-weekly. And we have free guides on our website that can help to make your difficult conversations easier. And if you can manage to afford $0, you can get almost 1,000 hours of content for that investment.
Well, I mean, really, this is such a treat and an honor what you've given us. Thank you so much. Folks, for other resources here, if you go to the American Negotiation Institute.com website, it's just filled with information. In fact, it says over 5 million downloads of the Negotiate Anything podcast. So, and then almost 700,000 people trained. So those of us who are here today might get and deserve to be included in that number. And it's just amazing. The 2 books, you did mention one of yours, Kwame, but let me just give you a plug here for both of them. The one you mentioned, the one from not quite a year ago, How to Have Difficult Conversations About Race, Practical Tools for Necessary Change in the Workplace and Beyond. And then your first book, Finding Confidence in Conflict, How to Negotiate Anything and Live Your Best Life. just a fountain of amazing inspiration and information. So thank you. Thank you very much. Are we getting
My
questions?
pleasure.
We
Yeah,
are.
we have a
Go
couple of
ahead.
them. This is great. So first one is from Sean. How do you facilitate building of trust between parties with long-standing trust issues? Sean, I have a story for you. So I remember when I was negotiating, when I was negotiating a deal on behalf of a client back when I was practicing law. Um, there are these moments in law sometimes where your client tells you a story, and then when you actually encounter the other side, you get information and you find out, oh my gosh, I'm representing the bad guy. What happened here? What in the world do we do? And so I got that information. I was like, okay, got to change strategy here. What are we going to do? So we were negotiating. It was like a 3-hour long negotiation. And then I saw the other side, like I was engaging with the lawyer on the other side, but then I saw their client he was engaged in the conversation, but he started to slink backward. And then he started to cross his arms and he was leaning back in the chair. So totally disengaged from the conversation. And I'm like, man, we lost him, we are losing him. And so I used compassion and curiosity. And a lot of people wouldn't feel comfortable just calling this out, but I recognize that emotion. And so I'm going to say, but I'm going to declare it humbly. So I acknowledged and validated the motion. And so I said, hey, correct me if I'm wrong, but it doesn't seem like you trust us very much right now. Silence. I just let that silence ride. And so after I asked the question, he was still there. He was quiet for about 5 to 10 seconds. He's like, no, I don't trust you and your client, and I don't trust you because of these reasons. And he laid all of those reasons out. And so this is one of those opportunities where that little lawyer in your brain is going to try to say, you're wrong because of this reason, this reason. But I found out in that conversation, I had no leg to stand on. And so in that instance, what I did is I just validated that emotions. I said, listen, I can understand why you feel this way. Given what you said and your perspective on this and that and the other, I can definitely understand why you don't trust us. And then I saw him start to soften his body language. Then I shifted to getting curious with compassion. And I said, what do you think it would take to earn that trust? Right? So I turned it into a negotiable issue. Because a lot of times, Sean, when you are negotiating or mediating between parties that don't trust each other, there are topics at issue. And then we start to focus the conversation on those topics. But what I do is I turn the issue of trust into one of the issues that we negotiate. And it's the first one. So what do I need to do to start to generate a little bit of trust? I don't need them to be like trusting each other and holding hands and going to the movies afterwards. Like, I don't think that's realistic. But what is it that we can do to get a wee bit of positive momentum going in this conversation? And I'll actually ask those people those things, right? Because then you get some interesting answers. So I would address it directly. And so in an interpersonal situation, it sounds like, with the way that you're framing that, Sean, that you're thinking about it in like a third-party neutral mediator type of way. But in a conversation with somebody else, what I'll do is if I've had a bad relationship with somebody, or we've had tough conversations or things like that, I'll address that straight up. I'll just say, hey, listen, in the past, we've had some tough conversations. And my hope is that in this conversation, we can see what it takes to get back on track, because you're somebody that I care about. And I want to see what it would take to re-earn your trust. We'll have a specific conversation on that topic. Great question. Great question. The speaker app. Tina, can you clarify which speaker app you were talking about? And then I'll tell you. Cool. Glad you all.
Yes,
like
you mentioned.
Oh, go ahead, Tina.
I'm sorry. You mentioned earlier that you have an app that counts. So I thought that was interesting.
Oh, yes. It's Fathom.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. It's Fathom AI Note Taker. So it takes it takes like this transcript of the whole conversation, and then it'll give you like a detailed summary of what was discussed. So it's like having an assistant with you in the conversation. Really nifty.
Sounds great.
Yeah.
Any other questions? We've got a few more minutes for Kwame.
Yeah, Alex. So is it possible to be safe even while in pain? If psychological safety is the basis of trust, would it then be accurate to say that we can trust others even when they hurt us because we are still safe with them? Man, 55 minutes. I almost made it without saying it depends. I'll just try. It's tough. It is really tough to be psychologically safe if you're in pain. I think I actually have an episode coming out in the next few weeks on forgiveness, like the power of forgiveness. It is really an underutilized concept in the context of difficult conversations. And so I think we have a responsibility to work to heal ourselves, but then we also have to recognize that pain has a purpose. Cannot name the condition, but there's a condition where you cannot feel pain. And at the like when you hear it, it's like, man, that sounds great. Those people have very short lifespans because pain comes with messages. If I can't feel pain, then I don't know what the danger is. So sometimes pain is telling you that this person does not deserve my trust, right? So that, I think that's a data point that we need to consider, whether or not the person deserves your trust, because depending on the pain that they put you through, they might not. And I think in those circumstances, sometimes you can create a trust mechanism, like in negotiation. If I don't trust a person, I can put a contingency agreement inside the negotiation where if something happens, it's an if-then proposition. Like, I don't trust you, and so I'm going to put this in so that there's a very clear mechanism that protects me. So I don't want to discount the value of pain in these situations because it carries important messages. We don't want to carry that pain inappropriately in a way that holds us back, but we do want to respect the message that it brings. Great question. Yeah. Awesome. Cool. No, this was fun. I appreciate the invite. And I know what everybody is thinking. Man, I want to donate to a food bank. And that's what I was going for.
Yeah, and in particular, the Mid-Ohio Food Collective, right? $1, $10, $100, whatever it might be, would be greatly appreciated. And Kwame, thank you. You're a true Renaissance man, author, business lawyer, TED talker, or a TED speaker. You have your TED Talks, founder and CEO of the American Negotiation Institute, all kinds of things. So thank you so much for sharing your valuable time with us. And everyone, we're back next week with another fantastic speaker every Thursday other than Thanksgiving and Christmas time. So please join us, sign up, www.willworkforfood.news, and we'll see you again. Thank you all so very much. Bye-bye.
My pleasure. See ya.